Thank you. The call to the member for Fisher.
On behalf of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, I present the committee's advisory report on the Transport Security Amendment, Security of Australia's Transport Infrastructure Transport Sector Bill 2024, and I ask leave of the House to make a short statement in connection with the report. Thank you.
Is leave granted? There being no objection, the member may proceed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On behalf of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, I present the committee's advisory report. There are 629 airports and 70 maritime ports in Australia playing a crucial role in the movement of people and goods between states and countries. Because of the sheer scale of movement through our aviation and maritime hubs, ports and airports remain significant targets for organised crime, terror and foreign interference. The strength and resilience of our supply chains is a critical issue of national security, our economic prosperity and national sovereignty. Only a few years ago, our nation felt the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our supply chains, and we would all remember that. With over 99% of Australian imports arriving by sea, we have to ensure that our maritime ports are able to prevent and respond to cyber threats. At the same time, our country thrives and relies on a strong visitor economy. On the Sunshine Coast alone, tourism and adjacent industries add over $900 million a year to our local economy. Communities like the Sunshine Coast depend on their airports. States like Queensland rely on maritime ports for trade, tourism and transit. And countries like Australia rely on global access and aspiration and on free and safe movement between nations and states. That's why issues like aviation and maritime transport security are so important. Mr Speaker, threats to Australia's transport security have evolved since the Howard Coalition government first introduced aviation and maritime security legislation over 20 years ago. Increasing reliance on digital connectivity means that malicious cyber activity is a real and a present threat. We saw this recently with the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport hack and the infamous CrowdStrike outage, which affected airports across Australia. That's why the Howard Coalition government introduced the initial legislation 20 years ago. That's also why the previous coalition government commissioned a review into Australia's aviation and maritime transport security settings. This review formed the basis of the Transport Security Amendment Critical Infrastructure Bill of 2022, which, though it lapsed at the 2022 election, forms the basis of this legislation. The committee has made several recommendations for the government to consider. Recommendations relating to the role of the Department of Home Affairs include the need to continue industry consultation so that any changes to subsequent regulations are both clear and accessible, that the department help reduce the regulatory burden on industry through guidance and training, and finally that duplication of reporting requirements across Commonwealth agencies be addressed, notably in relation to cyber incident reporting. The committee also makes recommendations that would amend the bill itself, relating to reporting-related offences and the need for a penalty regime that's responsive and scalable, and also safeguards around the use of expanded security directions powers. Mr Deputy Speaker, coalition members on the committee took the opportunity in the course of this inquiry to highlight the disproportionate impact of these burdens on regional and smaller entities. The Sunshine Coast area is home to Australia's 12th busiest airport, as well as smaller airports in Caloundra and nearby Noosa. We're a region which relies on visitors and which is developing a strong export base and aviation sector. We really do rely on our airports. That's why I'm pleased that the committee also recommended that the government consider an extended implementation timeframe for smaller affected entities. These entities are not as well resourced as those larger organisations and will naturally need additional support and time as they begin to shoulder the increased regulatory and cost burden, which comes as a result of this legislation. Madam Deputy Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm sorry. With all that said, the committee recommends that, subject to the implementation of these recommendations, that the bill be passed. On behalf of the committee, I extend my thanks to those who participated in the inquiry from industry, academia and the public service. I'd like to thank the Chair, Senator Ciccone, and my colleagues, including the member for Flinders, who's in the chamber with me this morning, the Shadow Minister for Defence and the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs for their hard work and collegiate spirit. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is a tremendous privilege to serve on the Parliamentary Joint Committee of Intelligence and Security. It is the only committee in the Parliament that receives classified briefings up to a top-secret level. It is a privilege to have served as the Deputy Chair. I would like to send a shout-out to all those within the national intelligence community, whether they are working in their offices or whether they are in the field. We often remark rightly and acknowledge the service of our men and women in uniform, but not often enough do we acknowledge the service of our men and women in our national intelligence community that keep Australians safe every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often in extremely difficult and challenging environments. We never talk about them. We never know their names. But on behalf of this Parliament and on behalf of this committee, I want to send out a big thank you and shout out to you wherever you are in the world. Thank you for your service. It is equally as important as our men and women in the ADF. Thank you. I commend the report to the House.
Authorised by Andrew Wallace, LNP, Boccarina, Queensland.